I'm really excited to bring to you guys this mastermind topic about the 4 critical aspects of real estate that you need to know right now. And I want to, before they jump on the call, I want to introduce you to Ash Sitlani of Tuttle and Sitlani. He is a licensed CPA. He'll be talking to you about Proposition 19 and just the benefits of owning real estate. Then we're going to have Brandon Burns of Investors 1031 Exchange. He's going to tell us how we can do 1031 exchanges for investment properties, how to defer those capital gain tax, and how to utilize the equity that you've earned in that investment property that has been performing for you so well, moving into better performing assets. Then we're going to talk to Doug Siebenthal from American Pacific Mortgage. He's going to talk about mortgage rates, the predictions of where we're going to see the real estate market going in concerns of the loans and the interest rates. And then we're going to talk to Sam McGovern of McGovern Law Group, who is a trust and estate attorney, where we're going to learn how to protect those assets that we just purchased so that we can keep the most amount of money in our pockets, whether, good things are happening, bad things are happening, just protect us all over, because you just spent, a lot of hard work to get these assets purchased and moving for you and your investments. So I want to welcome these people into the call, and I hope you guys enjoy it.
All right. All right. So today we are going to have an amazing mastermind with these 4 incredible individuals. We're going to be talking about the 4 critical things we need to know in today's real estate market. We're going to start off with our CPA, who's Ash Sitlani, who's Tuttle and Sitlani, and he's going to be talking about Prop 19 and a couple other options that are out there in order to help maximize your taxes when dealing with real estate. So Ash, take it away.
All right, guys, I'm going to share my screen here with you real quick. Again, like Greg mentioned, I'm Ash Sitlani. I am a CPA here in San Diego, California. We're going to talk about Proposition 19 that was passed in November of 2020. I'm going to share with you some slides today about how the previous structure of property taxes was set up and how it will be going forward. So the proposition is actually called the Family Protection and Fairness in Property Tax Reassessment Act, a little bit of a mouthful. It primarily affects 2 previously existing pieces of law, which were composed of 4 propositions. So it was Proposition 60 and 90, and also Proposition 58 and 193. In a nutshell, Proposition 19 changed 2 major areas. It changed transfers to being able to allowing you to keep your Proposition 13 value for transfers if you're a senior who's trying to replace their primary residence. And it also changed the parent-to-child transfers or family transfers. Previously, there was an ability for families to be able to transfer some properties, especially primary residences, and up to $1 million of anything else. So, whether it be your secondary residence, vacation home, a rental property, or commercial property, up to $1 million of that could be transferred to your children without any reassessments to market value. So this proposition changes that significantly in both areas. And so it's very important to just know how this proposition is going to impact those two different pieces. So before we kind of really dive into the Prop 19 changes and the calculations that come with it, I want to talk about Prop 13. So Prop 13 is really the foundation of California property taxes. We were one of the few, if not the only state in the country that has such a unique property tax structure. And all goes back to Prop 13 that was passed in 1978. So unlike many other states, California's property tax assessments are event-based plus inflation-based. So this means the original assessed value, which is generally your purchase price, is locked in as the starting point for all inflation adjustments for property taxes. And essentially, the fair market value gets ignored. This normally is not the case in other states where property tax is based on the current market value, plus there's an inflation adjustment normally. So as you'll see in the chart right here, that you have a purchase of a home for $500,000 in 2015, and right now, even in 2021, you would have the max hike you would have per year would be this incremental 2% hike, whereas and then the actual tax on that assessed value would be normally around 1 to 1.1%, depending upon the county that you're in California. So unless there's a significant event, which primarily means, a sale of the property, that property will continue to be assessed only at that incremental hike every year, and you ignore the appreciation in the property's fair market value. So the impact of this really cannot be understated, as it's a significant built-in protection from taxes, specifically property taxes. And essentially, the longer you hold the property, the more beneficial the system is for you, because generally real estate will continue to climb in value. So it's certainly a boon for families, to be able to pass this down. Also, this applies to all primary residences and also commercial properties as well. So let's say you have a rental home that you purchased in 2015 for 500,000, you'd be looking at the same chart. Let's say you purchased a multifamily unit or a commercial property such as a strip mall or whatever else. It all still technically falls under Prop 13, and you do maintain that original assessed value as the starting point, and then you have just basically the California CPI adjustments to that on an annual basis. So now let's get into kind of what Prop 19 has changed. So Prop 19 is actually already in effect now as of February 16th, 2021. Prior to this, the way things worked was you did have a way to transfer into a new primary residence, but it only applied to people that were over 55. The conditions that had to be met were that the new property had to be of lesser than the current market value of your home, which made it very difficult unless you were, significantly downsizing. And it was also county-based. So if your county did not offer such transfers, you were basically out of luck. In addition, for the most part, it was only for transfers within your own county. So it's not like you could really move a great distance, within the state. There were some counties that allowed you to bring your basis from another county, but overall, it was kind of a pretty broken and disjointed system. I have an example in here. So like San Francisco County was one of the biggest ones that did not reciprocate. So, let's say if you were kind of right outside that county in Marin County or whatever, you couldn't, just move into San Francisco County and bring your old basis. So if you had someone that's a senior, that might have a property that might have had an original basis of $200,000-300,000, and we kind of know what's happened to the property values up in the Bay Area. Essentially, those people were just kind of stuck because a lot of the counties weren't reciprocating on the county tax transfers. So also it was a one-time transfer, so you could do it once and then that's kind of it. And again, yeah, you have to be over 55 to be able to actually do that. Under Prop 19 now, here on the right side of the slide, you'll see how effective February 16th, this will now be a much more, I wouldn't really call it seamless process, but a much more easier process to go through. And it's a much, I've already heard of some clients that have done this, and it is relatively pain-free because essentially every county is now conforming and every county has roughly the same sort of portal set up for you to be able to apply for that, tax basis transfer as well. So the biggest upgrade here is that you can now transfer to a property of any value, lesser, greater. You can have someone move from, a small condo on the beach to a large house inland or vice versa. The values can be millions apart. It doesn't matter, but you will add on the difference between the market values of the properties, and we'll get into that.
So the benefits is, okay, so like it's a primary residence, I got, right? So it has to be your house.
Yes.
Before you could only transfer it once and the value had to be less. And you have to be 55 or older no matter what to use this. Now you can purchase any house that's even more expensive or less expensive, it doesn't matter. And you can purchase anywhere you want in the state of California while using this system.
Exactly. And that's going to most likely be the biggest driver or the biggest usage, I believe, will end up coming from that. So you could have now, someone moving from San Diego to the Bay Area to San Diego, someone from Inland Empire into San Francisco or wherever else, and essentially you're still going to have a difference in the value because there'll likely be a market value difference between a property, let's say in the Inland Empire versus coastal San Diego. So let me kind of show you how that works. So here's an example where you have an individual, let's say that was living wherever they may be living, and they had an original purchase price of let's say $200,000, and the current assessed value of that property is now $300,000. And then the actual fair market value of the house, now that they're going to sell it in 2021, the value of the house is actually $1 million. So they originally had an assessed value of $300,000. Now this individual is buying a house for $1.5 million. So they've actually upgraded in total market value of the property, and I imagine in the property as a whole. So in this type of scenario, you have someone that's going from a property that's actually worth $1 million to $1.5 million. So there's a roughly $500,000 upgrade in the market value of the property as well. So the way the new transfer system adjustment formula works is essentially they take your existing value or your existing assessed value, and they basically add on the difference between the fair market value of your old and new properties. So you take that $300,000 and then you'd add basically the $500,000 difference, like we mentioned. So you take the $1.5 million minus the million, 500,000, add your original 300,000. So on this now new property to you that costs you technically $1.5 million, your property tax on that will actually only be $800,000. So now obviously this is an example where you have a large upgrade in assessed values, but I mean you could still technically have someone that's just moving from let's say they're moving from La Jolla to Del Mar, right? And the scenario is similar where you have a property worth $1 million in La Jolla, assessed value of 300,000. They're moving to a property that's also worth $1 million or $1.1 million in Del Mar, right? So it's not that much of a difference in that type of scenario. So
yeah, but they're saving almost $8,000 a year in property taxes by using your example, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
this is a big thing. They're saving $8,000 a year to purchase something that's $500,000 more. So that's a big savings.
Exactly. So yeah, basically the reason this entire prop was enacted was to enable seniors to be able to move around more, right? Because you have a lot of people that were kind of in this scenario where they might have too much house essentially, where they may or may not no longer want to stay in that. They might want to use that to fund the rest of their retirement, because generally in America, most people that are middle class, almost your entire net worth is tied up in your home. So oftentimes you get, as you get closer to retirement, this is one great, your house value is a great source of funds that you can technically tap. But a lot of people weren't doing it, or they were doing it via HELOCs or reverse mortgages. But what this allows you to do is technically allows you to either upgrade in home or or downsize and carry that old property tax basis, so you don't have to worry. Basically, when you're 55, 65, whatever, however old the individual may be, they don't have to worry about selling their $3 million property on Coronado, on which they might have only had like a $300,000, $400,000 basis, to now step down to, let's say, a $700,000, $800,000 condo elsewhere, and have to worry about now paying property taxes on $700,000, $800,000, whereas they were paying $300,000, on $300,000 on this much larger property. So this will actually enable them to go ahead and just carry that basis when you're in a scenario where you're going, let's say from $2 million to $600,000, you'll be able to basically retain your original basis with your move. And so yes, you'll have your large gain on sale of your property, and then you can take some of that money and use that to probably buy in cash or get a mortgage, because it's better usually for taxes to have that interest expense. You'll be able to purchase a property and still be able to maintain that original property tax basis. And in that scenario, yes, let's say you're upgrading to, or you're downsizing to an $800,000 condo, you'll keep your original property tax basis at $300,000. So you're basically, saving property taxes on that $500,000 difference there as well.
It seems incredibly beneficial for, the prices and the valuation of homes that have gone up so much in the last, 5 years.
Right. Yeah. So this will certainly allow, people to basically move around more. It enables mobility more, for seniors overall, which I think will be pretty beneficial for the real estate market as a whole, because it'll allow, people that wanted to downsize will be able to downsize. People that wanted to upgrade will now be able to upgrade without worrying as much about, large changes in property taxes.
Awesome. Well, what other tips do you have for us today?
Well, so another thing that actually this proposition also changed is that it significantly affected the parent-to-child transfers. So, the government giveth and the government taketh away. So this is kind of their how they're going to end up paying for the shortfall in their budgets. Essentially, is they've really now changed the parent-to-child transfers. So prior to Prop 19, the way it essentially worked is if you had a parent that had a principal residence, they could transfer it to their children, and there would be no reassessment on the value of that property, and there was no value limit. So you could have a celebrity out in Hollywood who's got this property that they purchased for $10 million 30 years ago. That's now worth 50, 60, 70, $100 million, whatever it may be, could essentially be transferred to their child, and there would be no adjustment in the property tax value of that property to fair market value, at either the date of death or when they've bequested that property to their child. So and there was no residency requirement. So essentially, your child could then technically, let's say on the date of death, would receive that property and they could sell it then and there, and they would essentially have, no property taxes don't matter as much there, but it's more of a conversation of estate taxes at that point. But essentially, if they were to then rent out that property, let's say, to someone for $50,000 a year or whatever, their property tax on that will actually still be based on that original purchase price plus the incremental 2% adjustments that the parent has had. So basically, you maintain your parent's property tax basis. Also, under the old parent-to-child transfer rules, you had a cap of $1 million in cumulative assessed value, essentially. So, like, if you had something other than a primary residence that was being transferred, like a vacation home, a rental property, a commercial property, up to, combined however many you have, up to $1 million of that, basically got no reassessment in value. So, let's say if you had a parent that left 3-4 condos to their children that were worth $150,000, $200,000 each, and this has to be based on the fair market value, not the original assessed value. Essentially, there would be no reassessment to market value for property taxes on those properties. The estate tax thing would be a little bit different again. So
this could be a great way to, help your kids out, to give them a leapfrog up in this world, and give them a much lower tax basis for them to, start their real estate portfolio.
So that's the prior rule. The new rule is a little bit different. So now what Prop 19 did to that, so this is where I was saying the government giveth and taketh away. So they gave us those easy transfers for 55 and up. But what they're doing is now really modifying the parent-to-child transfer. And the way they're doing that is essentially when a parent transfers their primary residence to a child, the child must now also make that their primary residence to maintain that property tax basis, right? Whereas before, you could have your celebrity client or whatever that might have had a very large property with a relatively large basis, but now with fair market value, it's even higher. Even if it wasn't your residence, and no matter what the value was, the child was able to keep that original property tax basis. Now, the child has to actually move into the property to keep that original, or keep the tax basis of the parent, or the current tax basis of the parent. It'll still adjust for inflation going forward, obviously. Not only that, but now there's a limit on the property's value as far as what doesn't get the reassessment in fair market value. So if you have a property that a parent had purchased for, let's say, $200,000. It's now worth $1 million. If the kid moves in, and the parents' basis in it was 200,000, 300,000, whatever, because the current value of it is $1 million, your child gets to keep that property tax basis just like before. So relatively simple, and easy to do, and very helpful for your kids, certainly. But there is a potential now add-on for properties that are over $1 million in market value. So if you have a parent that, let's say, bought a condo in La Jolla, Del Mar for $300,000 back in the early 90s, that condo is now worth, let's say $1.2 million. Technically, what will happen is, and we'll get into the more details, that $200,000 difference will be added on to whatever the parent's basis was. So if the parent's basis was, 300,000, you're going to take that $200,000 difference and add that on to that $300,000, and that's basically what will become the child's basis. And then essentially any other properties, so your vacation homes, commercial properties, those will actually get reassessed to market value. So that's where it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge for people that are basically having, inheriting properties. Is you are going to see that adjustment in the fair market value. So here's a quick example of that. So you have a parent that bought a property at a particular price. Let's say it was $200,000-$300,000. Now that property is worth $500,000, and the market value of it is $1.6 million, right? So under the old rules, you would get to keep that $500,000, which is kind of great. Now the way it works is essentially you will take the market value of the property, subtract the $1 million allowance, right? And you would get basically that $600,000. So that you would then take and compare against the assessed value. And when you compare the two, basically, you will then take the higher amount as your assessment going forward. So I think I misspoke there actually previously. So in this scenario, what you'd be looking at is actually that $1.2 million condo. You'd subtract the $1 million, which would be $200,000. You'd compare that to the original assessed value of $300,000, I believe we said. So yeah, in that
essentially they'd keep their,
they'd actually
they would keep their.
So there is a certain point where you'll actually hit that, a break even, and then after that you'll actually be at a higher assessed value. So this still keeps the parent to child residence transfer relatively good, I'd say, because yeah, you have a property here that's $1.6 million that your child will now have a $600,000 assessed value on which to pay property taxes on. Whereas, yeah, you were paying $500,000, so it is increasing by $100,000, but it's still a massive, boon, I would say, to the family as a whole, because you're talking about basically $1 million of assessed value or a fair market value that gets ignored still for this child, and this is going to keep carrying forward, right? Because essentially, yes, you are now the individual taking over this property, $600,000 is your assessed value. If you then later transfer this to your child, there'll be a similar, transfer adjustment formula that'll be applied to it. And so basically,
if the rules don't change.
If the rules don't change, of course.
Well, that's awesome. I want to open up, do Brandon, Doug, or Sam, do you guys have any questions about the Prop 19 aspects?
Yeah, I actually do, Ash. Obviously, when inventory decides to show up again, I can see this kind of being implemented much more with the 55 and over, is trying to change locations within obviously the state of California. Yeah. I haven't seen one of these come across my desk. Obviously, it just got put into place in February, like you said there. Mm-hmm. But how do they go about it? Obviously, they don't get a lucky golden ticket that they just turn in for their new mortgage, because the reality is if you can take those other taxes on the new purchase, you're going to have much lower closing costs. And if you also want to have an impound account, obviously what's going to get collected for the impound account is going to be much less. So for a lender, since I haven't seen this, how do we go about even doing that transfer when we're going to set that up?
So for the lender, it's really going to be based upon, whether there's a current mortgage on the property already, how the family is deciding to do the transfer. So if the property is paid off, you're not going to see anything on your desk until, likely the kid decides to refinance the property. And at that point, all you're going to see is the existing assessed value. And where they're going to actually apply for this is actually through the county. There's actually a form that needs to be filled out, or it can be done via the county portal if your county provides it. And essentially it'll be, it's I believe like a 2-page form that you're filling out where you'll basically request your parent's basis, and you'll basically explain out that, yes, this is a transfer from a parent to a child. You'll show the calculation if a calculation needs to be done, which would be if the property is over $1 million. But other than that, from a mortgage perspective, I'm not too sure how you'd see it if, there's an existing mortgage. And imagine that's not really being transferred to the child because it's just going to be a new mortgage at that point.
Yeah. But I guess I was more towards, I'm not so much on the parent to child one as where if they're over 55 and they do decide to downsize, what you're saying before, they would already have that put in place. That is what you're saying. They would just go and fill it. And then we would just flip that over on our end to make that work with the transfer of the taxes from the old place to the new.
For like impound and such.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Because the reality is when you still have to pay closing cost taxes up front at some point, right? There's enough that are built into it. Or if you have an impound account, depending on the basically the algorithm of it, how many that have to be collected on the month that you're closing. It can make a huge difference when it comes to closing cost of what has to come to the table at the end. So that's where I was just curious, where do they go to start that process? And
in that scenario, it actually could very well be up to the mortgage lender itself, where essentially you might have a situation where the mortgage lender might actually assess the property at fair market value and want to impound the escrows based on that amount. And it'll take until that supplementary period where the individual can, once they've actually purchased the house, then go file the form to correct their property taxes. And most likely the individual will end up with a large refund from their escrow after that first year.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense because we base it off of 1.25 of the purchase price. So, again, I haven't seen this come across my desk. So I would be kind of curious if it's something that's going to be able to be done up front, or like you said, they'll just reanalyze the escrow account and then they'll kick it back out.
Right. And that might really be lender based. I haven't really seen that occur yet, so I'm not too sure. But I imagine, most mortgage lenders, they're not going to want that impound account to be anything less than the purchase price times, 1.15, whatever it may be in that particular county. So most likely, if it's going to be a mortgage property, you're going to likely have to, either do a cash purchase, right? And then refi it, or you're going to have to go through the process where, yes, your impound account is going to be higher, or you could choose not to impound initially. Get that amount, get your assessed value, basically reassess from the fair market value to the transfer basis value.
And then reestablish your impounds at that point.
And then apply for the impounds.
And this is a great question, Doug. And this is a reason why, having your lender and your CPA in the conversation whenever you're doing any kind of real estate is very, very important, because these guys could probably talk for another 20, 30 minutes about all the different nuances. So again, thank you, Ash. Make sure you guys reach out to Ash Sitlani if you have any questions. And it kind of transfers right over nicely over to Brandon from Investors 1031 Exchange. And so he's going to talk about the tax benefits of a 1031 exchange and how to utilize, selling your house through a 1031 exchange. So Brandon, take the floor.
Greg, thanks for that intro. And I really enjoyed listening to Ash and Ash and Doug. Great questions, guys. Real quick, what I want to do is go over two things. First of all, what are the taxes you may have to pay if you don't do an exchange on an investment property, right? Because I believe with good data, you can make good decisions. And with a lack of good data, you make random decisions. So I'm going to cover that first. And secondly, I'm going to cover the hurdles that the IRS has put in place that someone has to accomplish to do a fully tax-free exchange. Now, inside a 1031 exchange, there are a lot of nuances. You can do partial exchanges. There's some cool kind of tricks, but today I'm just going to go over, what's the dollar difference to you doing an exchange or not doing an exchange? And then secondly, if you want to do a fully tax-free exchange, what do you have to do? So first of all, there's 4 potential taxes that a seller of investment property may have to pay. The first one is your federal capital gains that goes to Washington, D.C. and that's 15 to 20% depending on your tax bracket. The second tax you will have to pay, is the California state tax. Goes to Sacramento, that's 10%. So now we're at roughly, let's call it 25 to 30% taxes. The third tax that you will have to pay is the net investment tax, which goes to fund the Affordable Health Care Act. That's 3.8%. And then if you've taken any depreciation at all, which a vast majority of real estate owners have taken depreciation if they've owned it for any length of time, you have to pay 25% of that back. So assuming that someone had been holding a property for 10 years and they've depreciated it by a third, the tax bracket across all four of those taxes would be in the high 30 to low 40% tax bracket. So I think it's important to understand, some folks say, gosh, I know I need to pay some taxes, but I'm fine with paying taxes. I want to pay my fair share, and they get that tax bill and it's $100,000 more than they anticipated. And so I think it's important to understand that. The second thing that I want to talk about is, what are the 4 hurdles or the 4 requirements in order to do a fully tax-free exchange? So the first one is a time component. After you sell the property, you have 45 days to identify a number of options that you may potentially or may not close on, and you have 180 days to close on one of those properties. Now, those timeframes don't run back to back, they run concurrently. So both clocks start the day that you close escrow. So in this hot market, sometimes people tell me, gosh, Brandon, I'm concerned that 45 days is going to be a challenge to find a replacement property. And one a trick that you can sometimes do is, if you're a seller, you can put a clause in the contract that says, if I'm struggling to find a investment property as a replacement, then I have the ability to push closing by 15 or 20 days. So that can give you, an additional time period. So, it shouldn't be, at 45 days sounds kind of scary, but it shouldn't be that much. So, for example, if you have a 21-day close, then you have an extra 15 or 20 days built in if you need it. And then you have 45 days to identify, now we're talking about a very reasonable amount of time to find another property. And that's where, Greg can come in and be so helpful and really make a difference. Having a good agent really makes a difference on that transaction. I would just really recommend anyone, please don't work with your cousin's friends who used to be a bartender and now they're a realtor. You really need to work with someone like Greg who knows what they're doing. So anyways,
and also that 180 days also, you just need to identify properties in that first 45 days. So just because you have identified a property doesn't mean you have to close. So as long as you keep identifying properties, you're moving that ball forward, because a traditional escrow is around 30 days, give or take 5 or 10 on either end, right? So realistically, that's 180 days is a lot of time to actually look for those properties, as long as you're actively identifying properties and showing it to your 1031 exchange agent. Am I correct with that?
Yeah. So, a lot of people will come in and they'll say, hey, I'm going to identify 3 properties, right? So you can unidentify them, you can identify them. At the end of that 45 days, they're locked in. So a lot of people say, okay, well, I found one, it's a maybe, and I found another one that's a maybe, and I found another one that's kind of a long shot. And so I'm actually going to identify 3 different properties: my number 1 lead horse, a backup, and then, should all else fail, I'm still okay, 3rd option. But yeah, 180 days is a long time. 180 days ago, it was summer, right? So in the summer. So there's definitely enough time there. The second requirement, so the first requirement was time. The second requirement is that you buy the same amount or more of your net sales price. And the IRS defines a net sales price as your sales price minus any transaction costs. So if you have a realtor fee, you have the escrow fee, you have title fees, then you just need to purchase more, equal or greater to the amount of real estate that you sold as your net sales price. So that's hurdle number 2. Hurdle number 3 is the IRS rules say you cannot take constructive receipt of the funds. So that means you can't touch your bank account. You have to use a qualified intermediary like my firm, and you can't put your fingers on the money or it becomes a taxable event. So as long as you don't touch it, that's super important. that still keeps you in compliance for a 1031 exchange. The fourth, and this one is probably the one that matters the least for most people, but it is important. I do want to mention it, is there has to be continuity of title. So if you're selling a property, buying a property, that's fine. But if you have an investment property with a partner and you decide you hate their guts, or it's a family member and they made fun of you at Thanksgiving for being fat, then and you don't want to be in a relationship, a financial relationship with them going forward, then you have to either change the title prior to selling, or you have to move together. So I think that's important to understand. And then the last thing I want to touch on very briefly is a 1031 exchange is a like kind exchange. And a lot of people ask me, oh, gosh, Brandon, a like kind exchange, I'm selling a duplex. Does that mean I have to buy another duplex? The answer is no. So the IRS says a like kind exchange means real property. So anything that's real property qualifies as a like kind exchange. That means you can sell a duplex, buy a piece of land. You can sell a single family home, buy a multifamily. You could sell a hotel and buy 5 single family homes. You could even potentially buy mineral rights. So as long as it's defined as real property under the IRS tax code, you can move in and out of things that to us may be different, but the IRS classifies as like kind exchanges. So that's, Greg, that's pretty much all I had to talk about today. I'm glad to go into more detail on specific cases, but that's what I wanted to talk about.
Perfect. And then do you guys have any questions? Sam, Doug, Ash?
Yeah, I do hear that the cousin's realtor that's the bartender does make a killer drink when they're showing homes. So
I mean, that's important. I don't know. That's what I base my largest financial transaction on personally, but supposed to each their own.
Well, that's how they get you to buy the house you don't want. You're already liquored up by the time you sign that RPA.
Sign hard, press here.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. And then next, we're going to talk about actually purchasing properties with Doug from American Pacific Mortgage. Doug, kind of give us the rundown of what's going on in the mortgage world. Let's see, it's March 23rd, 2020 right now.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of bounce around here just a bit, right? Because first thing that people always talk about when they hit me up is what are rates like, right? Well, that's the open-ended question, because a rate for one person isn't a rate for another person. And what I always find it funny is it's almost like I call them barbecue rates, right? So if you ever go to a barbecue and there's a bunch of people around there and they just refied or bought a home, they always like to throw out what their rate is, but nobody ever tells you how they got to that number, right? So one person might have put 35% down, another person put 5% down. One has a VA loan, one has a conventional loan. So they don't really pertain to every person. And that's the problem with when they hear radio commercials. Everybody thinks that rate's their rate. With that being said, rates are going up. They broke through, this is I think our third week in a row that we're in the 3s. And that we haven't been there since I think it was January 2020. But they're going to slowly tick up, I think. How far it's going to move, I think it's going to be subtle. I think we'll probably still be in the 3s before the year's over. And that's for a primary purchase. What's going on right now with investment in secondary homes is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they only want to carry 7% on their books right now. And so by doing that, they just raised rates on there for refis at the moment. So I actually looked at the rates this morning, and they are 200 basis points more than what they were. So for instance, what
does that mean?
Yeah, I'm kind of took a couple of notes here. So as of like a week ago, you could have done an investment refi and been right around 3.625, give or take, somewhere around there, maybe an eighth of a point difference in there. And as of this morning on a refi, we were at 4.375, 4.5, depending on the loan to value of the house or the duplex or whatever kind of property it was. Obviously, loan to value plays a big part on those kind of investment properties there. So that you can see how big of a swing that is. Now, this is only on refis. It's not on purchases yet. But anytime Fannie or Freddie puts those things into implementation, they always seem to follow it back up. So don't be surprised And 2 weeks from now, a month from now, a day from now, they say, hey, we're gonna do it on purchases as well. And I think that's where it's gonna get a little dicey. But the reality is you're still gonna be in the fours, mid fours. And if you do want to pay points, there's really no cap on paying points as long as it makes sense on an investment property, unlike there is with a primary property. So I think there's still going to be potential out there, but like Greg, you and me have both kind of struggled with is having the right inventory out there for people to find it. But it definitely will start to slow down probably a bit of their purchasing power.
Hey, I want to jump in for 2 seconds and back up. What does it mean to buy points? What does that do?
So on a rate sheet, there's a thing called a par rate, right? So whatever, let's just say for today, we'll just use numbers that I'm just pulling out. Let's say today you wanted to buy a $600,000 investment property, and I pull the rate up, and you're putting 25% down, and the rate for a par rate, which means there's no cost to the rate whatsoever, is 4.5, right? Now you can buy that rate down. You can go 4.375. You can go 4.25. You can go all the way to 3.5 if you want. But there's a percentage that you have to pay for that. So basically, if the loan amount is $600,000 and you want to do 1 point to buy it down to 3% or whatever it is, again, I'm just throwing random numbers out without looking at it. You'd pay $6,000 to be on that, and that's $6,000 additional that you bring into closing to be at that rate. This could be a good thing, and this could be something that doesn't make sense. Every time I look at somebody's mortgage, it has to make sense, right? Because if it's a recoup period of 13 years for that $6,000 to buy it down from 4 to 3, to me personally, that doesn't make sense. But again, it depends on how long they plan on keeping that property and how long they plan on having that property for. If you're gonna have that property for 7 years, then you just wasted $6,000, basically. If you plan on having that property for 30 years and so on there, it could be a massive amount of savings over the life of the loan of 360 payments. So again, rates have to make sense when you're going to buy down points itself.
What's like the average, like, so if your interest rate fluctuates again, like let's say we're buying down the rate, like, so like if it's at 5%, we're buying it down to 4%, like how much are you saving, like purchase price wise, like how much more beneficial does it have to lower interest rate?
Basically it's going to just be you're going to feel it on your mortgage payment more than anything, right? It can definitely help you qualify if you're like stretched thin on your debt to income ratio, but let's just put it, every eighth of a point is probably about $40, right? So if you take it all the way down there, you're going to probably save, Ash is a CPA, he's the math guy. You'll probably save about $400 a month, right? That's a huge amount of savings. So then if you take 6,000 divided by 400 and whatever you come up with there, here, I'll do some math while we do this here. So 6,000 divided by 400 equals, so you're basically going to take, hold on here.
Good mortgage guy always has a calculator.
So,
it's an old school one too. He didn't pull out his phone, like that's.
Yeah, that's for sure, buddy. Staples, finest. So it would take you a little over a year or so for that to work out in your favor. So that kind of makes sense, right? But if it's going to take 8 years, 9 years, that might not make sense on the long run, depending on how long you plan on keeping that property, because just like Brandon's saying, some people, if you're going to do another like for like, you just paid $6,000 to save some money there. It might not make sense, if you're one of those guys that kind of like leases cars and trades them in every 4 years, it might not make sense on a house that you're going to go from one to the next to the next. So it's one of those things that obviously we can always explore, but it's something that I always say, again, I'm not trying to harp on it, but it needs to make sense. A lot of people, when they look at a rate sheet online, they don't know how to read it. So they don't even realize that there's already a point built into it half the time. And they're not looking at the par rate that the company is actually providing. Or they also put in there like they're assuming you're putting 30% down. I don't know too many people that go into a purchase usually, unless it is an investment property, that throw 30% down right off the bat. It doesn't happen much. So, but with that being said, with rates kind of moving, and if they start to move on the investment purchase prices, especially secondary homes, if they fall on secondary homes, I think you're going to start to see, and this is a prediction, and obviously my predictions don't always pan out for sure, like anybody else's, but I could see the investment property market kind of go to an area where maybe you're going to get more of that hard money lender and more investment groups picking them up instead of actually, the first time investor try to come in and buy their first investment property just because of rates. But again, it really just depends on how far we go with them. I still think if we're in mid fours, that's not a crazy rate if you really think about it,
Historically, we're still pretty low on interest rates.
Yeah,
sorry, go for it, Ash.
We were in mid fours not that long ago, right?
And that's what I'm saying is,
yeah,
most people don't realize that mid fours is still a great rate, but the problem is with the first time investor that's going out there after they bought their home a year ago or 2 years ago, and they have their 2.5 or their 2.75, it's always that upper number that scares them off. And so I think you'll get a little more hesitation, but somebody like Greg and myself can talk to them and at least kind of maybe put them in a perspective where it's still at good value at that point in time. So, and fingers crossed, maybe we won't have, maybe Fannie and Freddie won't actually go up the 200 basis points on purchases for secondary homes and investment properties. And then if that's the case, you're back in the threes.
Greg,
So
real quick, someone had told me at one point that, and I can't remember the exact numbers, so if you know it, that's great, but inflation over the past like 15 or 20 years averaged about a 4. So if the inflation number is close to that, isn't that essentially kind of borrowing almost free money at the end of the day?
Pretty much. And I agree with you. It is. That's why I always tell everybody, it's like money's cheap right now. So it makes sense to me. But like I said, when you're talking to anybody that does anything first time, especially first time home buyers, not so much the guy going to get their investment property. A lot of those guys kind of already get it, right? But if you have a first time buyer of anything, again, we go back to that barbecue rate. They heard that their friend got 2.25, but that's no longer exists. So now that they've got that scare factor that they're not going to be able to afford it. And I think that's just kind of one of those things where most people go onto the computer and they do their own mortgage calculator instead of having somebody put it together for them and take a look at their scenario and say, here's real numbers, and this is what it's probably going to be at. And my favorite part, and I have this conversation with Greg almost weekly, is where somebody will go and get a quote for a rate, but they're not in contract. That rate means nothing until you're in contract and it's locked. So being quoted a rate, I wouldn't determine my purchase power off of somebody else's rate that you're not in contract, because they're going to shift for the worst or for better. And that's kind of how you got to be transparent up front with them about it. And that's what I try to do on a daily basis for that part when it comes to purchasing.
And to put it into perspective, if your interest rate is lower than inflation, the money is, it's cheaper than what the money is, like the inflation of the money is going. So you're borrowing at cheaper than inflation. And then if you just look at from last year to this year, I mean, housing inventory prices went up by 15% on average, right? So like if you bought last year at a rate that's lower than inflation and your house increased by 15% in value, you're gaining equity, your money is, stretching so much further. So it makes so much more sense to borrow that money because your value is growing so much faster right now than you are, like if you were to take the dollar out of your pocket and buy that same property.
Oh, true. And I'm sure you guys have all heard this, or especially you, Greg, is how many people came to you and go, man, I wish I would have pulled the trigger last year.
When's the best time to plant a tree?
Yeah, and they're like, is it a good time to buy? Well, the reality is, and I was kind of reading this, and it always makes sense. I was reading this off the NBS Highway, and they're like chief economist is like, the best time to buy is when it makes sense for you. Can you financially afford it, right? If you can, and that opportunity arises, you know, you got to kind of seize the day of it. And that's the problem is most people keep waiting for rates to get better or the housing markets to shift, and all of a sudden prices drop $200,000. That's just not reality right now. And if you can get into a home, that's probably the sure thing that you're going to have going on.
And while having while having a CPA on the call, you know, like obviously talk to your CPA, but like, you know, there's a few questions that you have to ask yourself. Like, what is the monthly budget that you can afford, right? You know, what can you get qualified for? Now, is that a comfortable number? You know, is your job looking stable? Okay, cool. Well, then that's a budget that even if the market, you know, goes up and down and fluctuates, you can still pay that $5,000 a month, right? And then what does that monthly payment get you in a purchase price? Because you're stuck with on a monthly basis that monthly payment of your mortgage. But what does $5,000 get you a month? AKA interest rates, what's out there, what kind of house, where is it located, all that kind of good stuff. So if you're comfortable with the budget, you're comfortable with what type of house it gets you, are you comfortable in what location it gets you? If you can say yes to all three of those things, now's a good time to buy.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's another thing is when you do a qualification, always trying to find out, you know, you don't want to make somebody house poor. And so they have to feel comfortable with it. And then they have to come to reality. Is this going to be what I want? You know, and if you can get what you want in that, then it makes sense. It 100% makes sense. How many people do you think are kicking themselves right now that didn't want to go out to East County and Santee and buy that $400,000 house that's now worth $800,000 right now, 4 years ago?
Ash, you were going to say something? Oh, we can't hear you. Replug in your microphone. Okay. Well then, thank you so much. And then we're going to have Sam McGovern from McGovern Law Group. He's going to talk to us about how to protect these assets once we own them. So Sam, take it away.
Greg, let's try and get a couple slides up here for everyone real quick. But that is essentially the name of the game is you've worked hard to be in this position where you've acquired, whether it's a residence or this investment property. What you don't want to happen is to get that property all tied up in, you know, in a court case or in some sort of dispute. And I just confirm, am I showing you guys the right screen right now, my title slide?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so the first kind of question then that comes up is what exactly is a trust in the first place? So a trust is, it's sort of a pretty amorphous legal entity of sorts. It's kind of, I tell people it's like halfway in between a contract and a business entity like an LLC or something. So it's a prearranged contractual relationship that avoids court involvement in private affairs by setting rules for the management and distribution of assets in my description. A lot of people would say, oh, well, I have a will, isn't that sufficient? A will is essentially like just a set of directions. It's not the machine that's going to do anything. So if you have a will, yeah, that's going to set out who's going to get your property, but it's not going to do a lot of the important things that you might want, like creating a plan to use your property to take care of you if you become incapacitated before you were to pass away. And a will alone isn't going to avoid probate court after death. Probate is a process where the court follows your directions if you have them, or if not, it applies the statutory norms and it divides up your property, settles any debts, things like that. It's a process that takes, it used to say months, now probably, you know, the court's looking at backlogs, they're making it more than a year, maybe 2 years. It's a significant amount of time. I'll talk more in a little bit. It's a significant amount of money as well to have an attorney guide your assets through that process. And a trust is also going to allow you to have more control and sort of set the rules for longer term as to how your property is used. So getting into a little bit more of what makes up a trust. It's a contract between people in three roles, or generally three roles. So first you have your grantor, who's someone who's putting property into the trust. That's the person who is creating the trust essentially and applying it to their property. The beneficiary is someone who's going to, as it sounds, receive the benefit of the trust property. They're going to get to use it or get the income from it. And then you have a trustee, who's your fiduciary, who is managing the property according to the terms that you've set out. So with a revocable living trust, which is what most people would use for like a residence, something like that, during your lifetime, you get to be in all three of those roles. So you're putting your property into the trust, you still get to you still get to manage it, and then you're also the beneficiary. You're still using that property, living in it, getting income from it if it's an income property. And that's where it's a little weird. Like, yeah, you're just you, but legally, all of a sudden, you're three different people now. And then, so like I mentioned, one of the biggest immediate and most certain issues that comes up with a will versus a trust is this financial burden that happens if you were to pass away. So I like to use the example of a gross estate worth $1 million, which here in the San Diego area is a lot of homes are right in that range anymore, which is crazy, but that's what it is. So looking at the gross value of your estate, let's say it's just a house, whatever it is, it's worth about $1 million. So if you just had a will or no plan at all of your property is going to go through probate court, creating a public record of the transfer, who that property went to, any disputes as to the property between the family, things like that. Now, attorney's fees for probate court are generally charged based on a statutory maximum scheme that's set out in the probate code. And it's a formula of 4% of the first amount, then 3, then 2. It kind of steps around based on the value. But what that adds up to for a gross estate worth $1 million is about $23,000 in fees. And like I mentioned before, maybe 9 to 18 months. Hard to say. It kind of also depends on any disputes or debts that are in place there. Now take that same $1 million property or $1 million gross estate and let's place it in a trust. You're looking at attorney's fees and trying to, it depends on who you go with. I'm putting kind of a general estimate of a base price there. If it's just one individual who's owning the property, maybe about $1,900, $2,000 for a revocable living trust plan, or $2,900 if it's a couple executing a joint trust. And then for the timing of it, it's really no practical delay. It's simple as your successor trustee in the trust stepping in, and now they can manage that property rather than waiting on the court to make the transfers. And also when it's a property that's being transferred via a trust, it's a private transfer rather than court proceedings as to dividing everything up.
So if go back a slide, if I understood this correctly, like really what a trust is doing is if something terrible happens, if you don't have a trust, not only are you in a horrible position where someone has died who's close to you, now it's going through a public court system where everybody knows about it. Everything it can be found on the internets. And it's going to probably cost me about $23,000. If I have a trust, it's going to cost me maybe $2,000 to $3,000, and everything stays private and it happens instantly. So I'm not dragged through a court system for 18 months
exactly
or more.
And so a lot of people say, well, that's not, that's $20,000 I'm not paying, but it's, that's a attorney bill that all of a sudden your descendants or your friends or whoever you're leaving that property to, that's something they have to come up with and figure out to make that process happen, rather than a tenth of that on the front end with a little bit of foresight and planning. So it's putting money towards your beneficiaries rather than as much as I'd like to accept that money, rather than giving it to an attorney in the probate process. Then some of the kind of additional broad categories of benefits that a trust offers that came to mind just in this context of owning property and protecting it. Like I mentioned, it creates a plan for incapacity. So if, let's say something happened and you were to be hospitalized for an extended period, a lot of times with, as people get older with memory issues and things like that, it turns into a situation where they're sort of unable to manage their finances or their property. A trust allows your trustee, if you're unable to manage your affairs, the trustee can step in and manage them for you for your benefit. So now your trustee can take that property, whether it's an income property or whether it was just your residence before, they can turn that into income that is used to take care of you rather than, you know, your family having to step in and bear that financial burden if something were to happen. And then another, you know, we talked about tax bases. I guess bases is the plural, but your tax basis, you know, as opposed to your county property tax, capital gains tax, there's a major benefit in transferring your property through a trust, through a testamentary interest where a person inherits it, rather than a lot of times you'll see people, you know, maybe adding their child or a grandchild to a deed or something like that to try and do an automatic transfer through a joint tenancy deed. When it comes to your federal capital gains tax, you get what's called a step up if the property is inherited. So you kind of want the opposite of what happens in your county property tax when it comes to your federal capital gains tax. So let's say that the original owner bought the house for $100,000. Now it's worth, let's just say $1 million. So if you inherit that property, you're now inheriting a property with a basis for capital gains tax purposes of $1 million. If your relative or, you know, grandma or grandpa gave you that residence, put you on the deed, something like that, it's a gift. So if it's gifted to you, you're getting it at their tax basis. So what in that scenario where you have a $100,000 property that's now worth $1 million, that's a major capital gains tax exposure that can be avoided through a testamentary instrument like a trust. And then another way to think of a trust is sort of like a wallet of sorts for your assets and your business interests. So a trust can hold your interest in an LLC or corporation, which comes into play a lot of times, you know, as far as, especially with investment properties, a lot of times people want to, you know, well, most times probably want to have that in an LLC or some sort of corporation where they're getting income from the property, things like that. So a trust would hold your interest in that LLC. And then your interest can then be transferred. Your successor trustee can step in should you become incapacitated or pass away. They can step in and manage that LLC, or that interest is transferred according to your wishes. And then a trust also allows you to insert what's called a sort of a spendthrift provision or provisions, which provides some creditor protection for your beneficiaries. So that means that, you know, let's say you're setting up a trust where the property is going to be held and distributed over time for a child, something like that. It makes it so that your child can't go out and do something, incur a liability of some sort that would be able to attack the trust property. It doesn't work that way so much with a revocable living trust in California for the grantor, so someone who's creating the trust for themselves and then for their beneficiaries. So during your lifetime, California doesn't like doing much of the creditor protection side. Other states like Nevada allow you to do sort of a lifetime irrevocable spendthrift trust that would protect your assets. California seems it's more so either a good insurance policy or the business entity like an LLC is going to give you that protection from creditors. But in California, it does protect your beneficiaries. Once you pass away and that the property that's in the trust, that trust becomes irrevocable. So it gives you creditor protection in that way for beneficiaries down the line. That was my quick points. I will stop the screen share here. Do you have any questions or?
Any questions for Sam?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Sam, can you talk a little bit more about how you can essentially, you know, technically have your investment properties in your trust as well, and how those tend to get that step up in basis as well? Because that's actually a very big thing for a lot of families where, you know, I mean, I've done returns where essentially you've got families that have held, you know, multi-unit properties for decades. And as a parent passes away, the children are actually getting that massive step up in basis that allows them to then restart depreciation on the property against all that rental income that's still coming in.
And there's a lot of, you know, it kind of, when Brandon was talking about sort of the taxable events and the ownership of properties, so that a lot of that comes into play where if if you're changing the people who own these properties, you're adding in potential taxable events that can destroy that property tax basis. So a trust is allowing you to kind of hold it in one entity with different people stepping in as the managers, and the people receiving the beneficial interest of the property. And you're getting those benefits of the trust with the step up in basis. And that's, it kind of brings to mind another, right when with the Prop 19, right before February, a lot of people were freaking out. Some rightfully so, some not, about losing that with the county property tax, the way that was changing. Where it was hitting people was a lot of these big like hotels or big farms kind of in the middle of the state that have been in the family for years. And in those cases, sometimes it made sense to do a quick transfer. Other times, if it's just a house or something, a lot of times the capital gains step up benefit outweighs sort of the short-term property tax exposure. But yeah, it's an avenue for you to take your property and allow your family to use and enjoy and manage that property and benefit from it in the long term without having to do these things along the way that are kind of diminish the value.
Wonderful. Well, if there's no other questions, I want to thank all of you guys for taking the time and informing us of not only how to get into these properties, but how to protect them once you have them, and setting yourself up and setting your kids up for future generations of utilizing this great asset of real estate and investing. So thank you all so much. And, if you're looking for any kind of 1031 exchange, CPA, trust attorney, or mortgage broker, please reach out to these amazing individuals, as I know they will take care of you. So you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.